The moment my garage became empty, my family decided I was finished. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I am 71 years old, a widow, and for most of my life, I worked harder than anyone gave me credit for. My late husband and I built a logistics company from a single delivery truck and a rented warehouse. We spent decades growing it. Long hours, early mornings, missed vacations. We sacrificed everything to create something lasting. After my husband passed away 3 years earlier, I slowly began simplifying my life. One piece at a time, I sold equipment I no longer needed. Old tools, spare machinery, a trailer that had not moved in years. None of it felt emotional. They were simply things. By the beginning of that spring, only one item remained in the garage. The last truck. It sat in the center of the concrete floor like a loyal employee waiting for instructions. On a bright Tuesday morning, I signed the paperwork and handed the keys to the buyer. As he drove away, I stood in the driveway and watched the truck disappear around the corner. For a moment, the garage stood completely empty. Clean walls, bare shelves, open space. I felt strangely peaceful. What I did not know was that someone else was watching. My daughter-in-law Vanessa stood at her kitchen window next door. I noticed her for only a second before going back inside. At the time, it meant nothing. Later, I would realize it meant everything. That evening, the family gathered for dinner at my house. My son Brian arrived with Vanessa. My granddaughter Emma came straight from law school classes. The meal felt normal at first. We talked about traffic, weather, and Emma's exams. Then little things began to feel different. Vanessa asked more questions than usual. Questions about maintenance costs. Questions about property taxes. Questions about whether I planned to downsize. Her tone sounded friendly, but something underneath it felt calculated. I answered politely and moved on. After dessert, Emma helped me clear the table while Brian and Vanessa stepped onto the back patio. The kitchen window above the sink was slightly open. I was not trying to listen. Their voices simply drifted inside. "So the garage is finally empty," Vanessa said. Brian replied with something too quiet for me to hear. Then Vanessa laughed softly. "Now we know the truth." I froze with a plate still in my hands. "She must have needed the money," Vanessa continued. "Nobody sells everything unless they have no choice." My stomach tightened. Brian did not argue. He did not defend me. He simply stayed silent. The conversation shifted, and I could not hear the rest. But I had already heard enough. For the first time, I understood what they believed. They thought an empty garage meant an empty future. They thought the trucks had been my wealth. They thought the equipment had been my security. Most of all, they thought I no longer mattered. I finished washing dishes, smiled through the rest of the evening, and said good night as though nothing had happened. But later, standing alone in the dark garage, I looked at the empty floor and shook my head. The funny thing was, the most valuable thing I owned had never spent a single day inside that garage. The change did not happen all at once. That was what made it so easy to miss at first. People expect betrayal to arrive like a thunderstorm. Loud, obvious, impossible to ignore. In my experience, it usually arrives like a draft under a door, small enough to overlook until the whole room feels cold. During the week after the garage emptied, little things began shifting around me. Brian stopped asking for my opinion about family matters. For years, he had called me before making major decisions. He would ask about investments, repairs, even vacation plans. Suddenly, those conversations disappeared. At first, I told myself he was simply busy. Then came Vanessa. She started speaking to me differently. Not openly rude. She was too smart for that. Instead, she developed a tone people reserve for someone they believe is fragile. Every sentence carried a layer of polite pity. One afternoon, she brought over a casserole and spent 15 minutes talking about how difficult retirement could be. Then she casually mentioned several senior living communities she had researched. I nearly laughed. I still drove my own car, managed my own finances, and walked 3 miles every morning. Yet somehow she spoke as though I might forget my own address next week. Emma noticed it too. We were sitting on my back porch one Saturday afternoon when she lowered her iced tea and frowned. "Grandma, has Mom been acting strange lately?" she asked. I smiled carefully. "That depends on your definition of strange." Emma hesitated. "She keeps asking Dad questions about your money." The statement did not surprise me as much as it should have. "What kind of questions?" I asked. Emma looked uncomfortable. "The kind people should not ask." That answer told me everything. 2 days later, another small crack appeared. Brian invited the family to dinner at his house. During the meal, the conversation turned to home maintenance. The roof over my garage was nearly 20 years old and would eventually need replacement. Before I could say a word, Vanessa jumped into the discussion. Well, at least there is no reason to keep such a large garage anymore. The room became quiet. Why is that? I asked. Vanessa smiled. You do not have any equipment left. There it was. Not the words themselves. The assumption behind them. In her mind, the value of the garage had vanished along with the truck. Emma immediately changed the subject, but the damage had already been done. Later that evening, as I walked to my car, I noticed Brian and Vanessa standing near their front door. They stopped talking the moment they saw me. I pretended not to notice. Age teaches you many useful skills. One of them is recognizing conversations that end too quickly. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Fewer phone calls, fewer invitations, fewer requests for advice. It was as though the family had quietly reassigned my role. Not matriarch, not decision maker, merely an aging relative waiting for life to happen around her. What none of them understood was that I had spent 40 years building businesses. I knew how to read people. And by the end of that week, I was beginning to suspect that the empty garage had not changed their opinion of me. It had simply revealed what their opinion had been all along. The moment I realized they were no longer talking around me, but talking past me, I started paying closer attention. People reveal themselves when they think you have stopped mattering. 2 weeks after the garage emptied, Brian called and invited me to lunch. At first, I felt relieved. For a brief moment, I thought perhaps I had imagined some of the tension. Perhaps grief and loneliness had made me overly sensitive. That illusion lasted exactly 23 minutes. We met at a small restaurant near the town center. Brian seemed distracted from the moment he sat down. He checked his phone repeatedly. He barely touched his sandwich. Finally, after several awkward pauses, he cleared his throat. Have you ever thought about selling the house? He asked. The question landed between us like a dropped plate. I set down my coffee cup and looked at him carefully. Why would I sell the house? I asked. He shrugged. It is a lot for one person. I smiled slightly. I have lived here for 38 years. I think I can handle it. He laughed, but it sounded forced. I'm just saying it might make life easier. Easier. That word seemed to be appearing more often lately. Easier to downsize. Easier to simplify. Easier to move. Easier for whom? The answer became clear 3 days later. Emma stopped by unexpectedly after her classes. She looked uneasy. Grandma, she said, I probably should not tell you this. That sentence immediately got my attention. Emma rarely spoke dramatically. Tell me anyway, I replied. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and took a deep breath. Mama's been looking at property values. I nodded slowly. For her own house? Emma shook her head. For yours. The room became very quiet. What exactly do you mean? I asked. Emma hesitated. Last night she was showing Dad recent sales in your neighborhood. She was estimating what your house could sell for. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not anger. Not yet. Clarity. Suddenly, several conversations from the previous weeks made perfect sense. The questions about maintenance. The comments about downsizing. The discussions about senior living communities. None of those conversations had been about helping me. They had been about evaluating an asset. That evening, I attended a family barbecue at Brian's house. I arrived early and walked through the side gate into the backyard. Voices drifted from the open kitchen window. I recognized Brian immediately. Then Vanessa. If she waits another 10 years, the market could change, Vanessa said. We should convince her while values are still high. My footsteps stopped. She loves that house, Brian replied quietly. She will come around, Vanessa answered. Once she realizes she cannot maintain it anymore. I stood there for several seconds. They were discussing my future as though I were not part of it. Not a mother. Not a homeowner. Not a person. A project. A problem to solve. When I finally entered through the gate, the conversation ended instantly. Vanessa greeted me with her brightest smile. Brian suddenly became fascinated by the grill. I smiled right back. But for the first time, I was no longer wondering whether something was wrong. I knew something was wrong. The only question left was how far they were willing to go. If there was one bright spot during those weeks, it was Emma. While everyone else seemed to be quietly reevaluating my worth, she remained exactly the same. She still stopped by after classes. She still called to ask for advice. She still treated me like the woman who had helped raise her instead of some fragile relic from another era. One Friday afternoon, she arrived carrying 2 coffees and a look on her face that told me something was bothering her. We sat on the back porch overlooking the garden my husband and I had planted decades earlier. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Emma sighed. "Grandma, I think Mom is planning something." I turned toward her. "What kind of something?" She stared into her coffee cup. "I do not know exactly, but she has been making calls. A lot of calls." My attention sharpened immediately. "To who?" Emma shook her head. "Real estate agents. Financial advisors. People I do not recognize." I remained quiet. Emma continued. "Last night, I walked into the kitchen, and she closed her laptop the second she saw me. That sounded exactly like Vanessa. Careful, controlled, always aware of appearances. Did you ask her about it?" I said. Emma laughed softly. "Mom said she was organizing future family plans." Future family plans. Another harmless phrase that somehow felt dangerous. The following week provided another clue. Vanessa invited me to lunch. She had not done that in months. The restaurant was expensive, far more expensive than the places she normally chose. Throughout the meal, she seemed unusually cheerful. She complimented my health. She complimented my appearance. She even complimented the house. Then, almost casually, she brought up retirement communities again. "Some of them are beautiful," she said. "Private dining, fitness centers, transportation services." I smiled politely. "I am very happy where I am." Her smile tightened slightly. "Of course. I just think it is important to plan ahead." There it was again. Planning ahead. Preparing for a future she seemed strangely eager to design for me. That evening, Emma called. "Grandma, you are not going to believe this." Her voice sounded frustrated. "Try me." Mom printed floor plans. I sat upright. "Floor plans? For your house?" A long silence followed. Emma continued. She was making notes in the margins. My stomach tightened. "What kind of notes?" Emma hesitated. "Things like guest suite, office space, renovation ideas." For several seconds, I simply stared out the kitchen window. Vanessa was not talking about selling my house anymore. She was talking about living in it. Suddenly, every conversation from the past month connected together like pieces of a puzzle. The garage, the questions about money, the discussions about downsizing, the concern about my future. None of it had been concern at all. It had been preparation. Somebody was already imagining a life after I was gone from that house. And judging by the confidence in Vanessa's behavior, she seemed to believe that future was much closer than I realized. The first real piece of evidence arrived by accident. At least that was how it appeared. A few days after Emma told me about the floor plans, she stopped by the house carrying a folder she had accidentally taken from her parents' dining room table. She did not realize what it was until she opened it while studying. The moment she saw my address printed across several pages, she drove straight to my house. We sat at the kitchen table while she spread the documents between us. At first glance, they looked harmless. Market reports, property assessments, neighborhood sales data. Then I noticed handwritten notes in the margins. Vanessa's handwriting. I would have recognized it anywhere. Beside one valuation estimate, she had written, "Potential after renovation." Beside another, she had written, "Could sell quickly." My eyes moved lower down the page. There, under a photograph of my home, was a note that made my stomach tighten. "Need Brian on board before discussion." I read the sentence twice, then a third time. This was no longer casual curiosity. This was planning. Careful planning. Emma watched my expression. "I told you something was wrong," she said quietly. I nodded. For the first time, I could not disagree. Later that evening, I called Brian. Not to confront him. Not yet. I simply wanted to hear his voice. Sometimes people reveal more than they intend. We spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Work, weather, Emma's classes, normal conversation. Then I casually mentioned replacing a few bushes in the front yard. There was a pause. "You were spending money on landscaping?" he asked. The question sounded strange. "Why not?" I replied. Another pause followed. "I just thought you might want to save your money." "Save it for what?" I almost asked. Instead, I thanked him for the advice and ended the call. Afterward, I sat alone in the living room thinking about every conversation from the past month. A pattern had emerged. Nobody asked what I wanted anymore. They only discussed what they thought I should do. Move, downsize, simplify, sell. Every suggestion pointed in the same direction. The following Saturday, the situation became impossible to ignore. I attended a charity luncheon downtown, and happened to arrive earlier than expected. As I entered the hotel lobby, I spotted Vanessa sitting with a well-dressed woman I did not recognize. They were reviewing papers spread across a small table. Neither of them noticed me. I moved behind a decorative column and looked more carefully. The stranger handed Vanessa a business card. Across the top, I could clearly read the company name. A real estate brokerage. Vanessa smiled and pointed to a photograph on one of the pages. My house. There was no doubt. My house. They spoke for several more minutes before standing to leave. I slipped away before either of them could see me. Driving home, I felt something shift inside me. The uncertainty was gone. The doubt was gone. Vanessa was not merely imagining a future involving my home. She was actively preparing for it. And if she was willing to meet with real estate professionals before even speaking to me, then I could only imagine what other plans were already being made behind closed doors. The second betrayal arrived on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. I was sorting old paperwork in my home office when Emma called. Her voice sounded tense. "Grandma, where are you?" she asked. "At home." A brief silence followed. "Good. Stay there. I am coming over." 20 minutes later, she rushed through my front door carrying a folder and an expression I had never seen before. Not confusion, not suspicion, anger. We sat at the kitchen table while she spread several documents in front of me. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. Then I recognized Brian's signature. My heart sank. "What is this?" I asked quietly. Emma pointed to a section near the bottom of one page. Dad signed authorization forms. I looked again. The paperwork involved property evaluations, financial disclosures, and preliminary planning documents connected to estate and housing options. Nothing illegal, nothing final. But that was not the point. The point was that my son had participated in discussions about my future without speaking to me first. I read every page carefully. The language was professional and cautious, yet the message underneath felt painfully clear. They were building a plan that included my house, a plan that included my finances, a plan that somehow did not include my opinion. For several minutes, neither Emma nor I spoke. Finally, she lowered her voice. "I do not think Dad understands what Mom is doing." I wanted to believe her. Truly, I did. But the documents sitting in front of me made that difficult. Brian was not an innocent bystander anymore. His signature proved that. That evening, I called him. Not to argue, not to accuse. I simply asked him to come by the house. He arrived shortly after dinner. The moment he sat down, he knew something was wrong. I placed the folder on the coffee table between us. His eyes widened slightly. "Where did you get those?" he asked. I ignored the question. "Why are you signing paperwork about my future?" For a long moment, he stared at the documents. Then he sighed. "Mom, it is not what you think." That sentence rarely improves any situation. "Then tell me what it is," I replied. Brian rubbed his forehead. "Vanessa thought it would be smart to prepare for different possibilities." "Different possibilities?" I repeated. "Such as?" He hesitated. "Moving, downsizing, long-term planning." Every answer sounded rehearsed. Every answer sounded borrowed. "And did it occur to either of you that I might want to be part of those conversations?" Brian looked away. That hurt more than anything he could have said, because in that moment I saw the truth. He was embarrassed. Not because the plan existed, because he had been caught. After he left, I sat alone in the living room watching rain slide down the windows. I kept thinking about the little boy who once asked my permission before spending $10. Somewhere along the way, that boy had become a man willing to sign documents affecting his mother's future without telling her. Emma called later that night to check on me. I told her I was fine. It was not entirely true. The betrayal was no longer coming from outside my family. It was coming from the people I had trusted most. And deep down, I was beginning to suspect that the paperwork I had seen was only the beginning. 3 days after my conversation with Brian, the person who changed everything knocked on my front door. David Turner had been my husband's closest friend for nearly 40 years. He was also the attorney who had handled most of our business affairs long before my husband passed away. We had stayed in touch over the years, but not closely. Life has a way of scattering even old friendships. When I opened the door and saw him standing there with a leather briefcase in his hand, I immediately knew this was not a social visit. "Can I come in?" he asked. Something in his tone made me step aside without asking questions. We settled into the living room. David placed the briefcase on the coffee table, but did not open it right away. Instead, he studied me carefully. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, he said. Have Brian and Vanessa been talking about your assets? I almost laughed at the understatement. Talking about them would be putting it politely. David nodded slowly, as though he had expected that answer. Then he opened the briefcase. Inside were several thick folders. Some looked familiar. Others did not. He removed one file and slid it across the table. My husband's name appeared on the cover. Seeing his handwriting after all these years sent a wave of emotion through me. What is this? I asked. David folded his hands. Something your husband instructed me to keep safe. I opened the file. Inside were legal documents, letters, and handwritten notes. At first the contents seemed ordinary. Then I reached a page dated only 6 months before my husband's death. The note was addressed directly to David. My husband wrote that if anything ever happened to him, certain protections were to remain in place until David believed the timing was appropriate. I looked up. Protections? David nodded. Your husband worried about something. What exactly? I asked. David leaned back in his chair. He worried that people would eventually see your visible assets and assume they understood your financial position. A strange chill moved through me. That was exactly what had happened. The garage, the equipment, the truck. Everyone had assumed those things represented my wealth. David continued. Your husband always believed that appearances could be dangerous. He reached into the briefcase again and removed another folder. This one was significantly thicker. Margaret, there are things you do not know. I stared at him. I helped build that business from the beginning. What could I possibly not know? For the first time, David smiled. More than you realize. He slid the second folder toward me, but placed his hand on top of it before I could open it. Not today, he said. There are still documents I need to organize. I felt frustration rising immediately. Then why show it to me? His expression became serious. Because I think the situation inside your family is accelerating faster than your husband anticipated. The room fell silent. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind for weeks. David, do you think Vanessa is after my house? He considered the question carefully before answering. No. The response surprised me. Then he added, I think your house is simply the first thing she can see. Those words stayed with me long after he left. Because if the house was only the beginning, then whatever my husband had hidden inside those folders was far more valuable than anyone in my family imagined. For the next several days, I could think about little else besides the folders David had shown me. The conversation replayed in my mind every morning and every night. My husband had hidden something, not from me out of distrust, but out of protection. The more I considered it, the more it sounded like him. He had always been the cautious one. While I focused on growing the business, he focused on preserving it. A week later, David returned. This time he carried the same briefcase, but there was a different energy about him. Less hesitation, more certainty. We sat in my study, and after a few minutes of polite conversation, he finally opened the second folder. The documents inside looked far more complex than anything I had seen before. Corporate records, partnership agreements, property holdings, investment statements. Some dated back more than 20 years. I stared at the pages in confusion. David, what exactly am I looking at? He slid one document toward me. The name at the top belonged to a company I vaguely recognized. Then another. Then another. My eyes moved across the pages. Suddenly I understood. These were not businesses we had owned directly. They were investments connected to businesses. Small ownership positions. Commercial properties. Distribution facilities. Assets quietly acquired over decades. Assets I had never paid much attention to because my husband handled that side of things. How much is all of this worth? I asked. David folded his hands. A lot more than most people would assume. That was not an answer. He knew it. I knew it. Finally, he gave me a number. For several seconds, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. The figure was far beyond anything Vanessa or Brian could possibly imagine. More importantly, none of it depended on trucks, equipment, garages, or visible property. The wealth had been hidden in plain sight for years. Quiet, protected, nearly invisible. I sat back in my chair and stared at the documents. Suddenly, every conversation over the previous month felt absurd. Vanessa measuring rooms. Vanessa discussing senior communities. Vanessa speaking about financial limitations she believed I faced. She had looked at an empty garage and reached a conclusion. A very expensive conclusion. David continued explaining the structure. Some assets produced income every month. Others had appreciated significantly over time. Several properties were now worth multiple times their original purchase price. The deeper we reviewed the documents, the clearer the picture became. The garage had never represented my financial position. It had merely represented the most visible part of my past. Before leaving, David handed me one final envelope. "Do not open this yet," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "You seem to enjoy suspense." He smiled slightly. "This one matters." I turned the envelope over in my hands. My husband's handwriting appeared across the front. Seeing it immediately made my chest tighten. "When do I open it?" I asked. David stood and collected his briefcase. "When the right moment arrives." After he left, I remained in the study for nearly an hour. The envelope sat beside me untouched. Outside, the afternoon sun illuminated the empty garage across the yard. For weeks, that empty space had caused everyone around me to underestimate me. But now I understood something important. The garage had become a test. And so far, every person chasing my assets had failed it. The only question left was how much farther they were willing to go before the truth finally caught up with them. The more confident Vanessa became, the more careless she grew. It was a pattern I had seen countless times during my years in business. People are most dangerous when they are desperate, but they are most vulnerable when they think they have already won. During the weeks that followed, her behavior changed noticeably. She stopped hiding her assumptions. She stopped disguising her plans as concern. Instead, she began acting like someone preparing for a future she considered inevitable. One Sunday afternoon, the entire family gathered at Brian's house for a birthday celebration. I arrived carrying a pie and found Vanessa standing in the kitchen with several design magazines spread across the counter. The moment she noticed me, she closed them. Unfortunately for her, I had already seen enough. Floor plans, renovation sketches, interior designs. Not for her house, for mine. Throughout the afternoon, I watched quietly. Vanessa floated through conversations with unusual confidence. She talked about property values, neighborhood improvements, long-term investments. Every topic seemed to circle back toward real estate. At one point, she even joked about needing more space for future projects. Brian laughed. Several relatives laughed. I noticed Emma did not. Later, while helping clear dishes, Emma pulled me aside. "She has been ordering samples," she whispered. "Samples of what?" I asked. "Flooring, paint colors, cabinet finishes." I nearly smiled. Vanessa was decorating rooms she did not own. The arrogance would have been impressive if it had not been so insulting. A few days later, another surprise arrived. Brian called and invited me to dinner. Just the two of us. That alone was unusual. During the meal, he seemed nervous. He kept adjusting his napkin and avoiding eye contact. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mom, have you ever thought about what happens if maintaining the house becomes too difficult?" There it was again. The script. The carefully prepared conversation. "No," I answered calmly. "Because maintaining the house is not difficult." Brian forced a smile. "Of course. I just mean eventually." Eventually. Such a useful word when someone wants to discuss your future without acknowledging your present. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the message remained the same. He was trying to guide me toward a conclusion I had never reached on my own. After dinner, I drove home feeling oddly detached. Not angry, not hurt, detached. Because for the first time, I understood exactly what was happening. Vanessa believed she had already solved the puzzle. She believed the garage represented my wealth. She believed the house represented my future. She believed every visible asset told the entire story. And because she believed that, she was building plans on a foundation of assumptions. The next morning, David called. "How are things?" he asked. I looked out the window toward the empty garage. "Interesting," I replied. He laughed softly. "That usually means trouble. Vanessa thinks she is winning." A pause followed. Then David said something that made me smile for the first time in weeks. "Good. Good." I repeated. "Why?" His answer came immediately. "Because people stop paying attention when they think they have already reached the finish line." After we ended the call, I glanced at the sealed envelope still sitting inside my desk drawer. My husband's handwriting stared back at me from across the room. For weeks I had resisted opening it. But something told me that moment was getting closer. And judging by Vanessa's growing confidence, she had no idea how dramatically the game was about to change. The right moment arrived on a quiet Thursday evening. I had spent weeks staring at the sealed envelope inside my desk drawer. Every time I opened the drawer, I saw my husband's handwriting and heard David's warning to wait. But patience only works when events remain stable. Things were no longer stable. Vanessa had grown bolder. Brian had become increasingly involved, and the pressure surrounding my house continued to build. So that evening, after dinner, I carried the envelope into the study and carefully broke the seal. For several seconds, I simply looked at the folded pages inside. Then I began reading. The first paragraph immediately brought tears to my eyes. My husband had written it in his familiar voice. Practical, calm, direct. He explained that the letter was intended for a specific situation. A situation where appearances had created dangerous assumptions. As I continued reading, my emotions shifted from sadness to disbelief. Then from disbelief to astonishment. The letter explained the structure David had only hinted at. Years before his death, my husband had reorganized a significant portion of our holdings. Not because he distrusted me. Not because he expected trouble. Because he believed wealth should be protected from short-term thinking and emotional decisions. The investments David had shown me represented only part of the picture. There were additional holdings, additional partnerships, additional assets placed into carefully structured arrangements that had continued growing quietly year after year. By the time I finished reading, I finally understood the full scale of what had been built. The number itself mattered less than the realization. My family had been evaluating me based on the contents of a garage, while completely overlooking everything that actually mattered. The next morning, I met David for breakfast. He watched silently while I placed the letter on the table. "You opened it," he said. I nodded. "You knew all of this?" He smiled slightly. "Most of it." I leaned back in my chair. "Why keep it hidden?" David stirred his coffee before answering. "Because your husband believed character is easiest to measure when people think nobody is watching." The statement lingered between us. Suddenly the last several months looked different. The comments, the planning, the assumptions, none of them had been caused by financial hardship. They had been caused by perceived financial hardship. Vanessa had looked at visible decline and concluded she understood the entire story. David reached into his briefcase and handed me another document. This one was far shorter. I scanned the page once. Then again. My eyes widened. "This cannot be right." David nodded. "It is." The document identified future control provisions for several major holdings. And at the center of those provisions was a name I had not expected. Emma Sullivan. Not Brian. Not Vanessa. Emma. My granddaughter. I stared at the page in stunned silence. My husband chose Emma? David smiled. Years ago. Suddenly dozens of conversations made sense. My husband's admiration for Emma's intelligence. His belief in her judgment. His constant encouragement whenever she showed interest in business or law. None of this had been accidental. He had been planning for the future long before anyone realized it. As breakfast ended, David looked directly at me. "There is going to be a family dinner next week, correct?" I nodded. Vanessa had been organizing one for months. "Good," David replied calmly. "Because I think everyone is finally ready to learn what an empty garage was never capable of showing them." The family dinner arrived the following Saturday evening. Vanessa had spent weeks planning it, and it showed. The dining room looked as though it belonged in a magazine. Fresh flowers decorated the table. New place settings gleamed beneath the lights. Even the menu felt carefully selected. Everything about the evening projected success, confidence, and control. Vanessa moved through the room like a hostess celebrating a victory nobody else knew had already been declared. Brian greeted guests with practiced smiles. Emma remained unusually quiet. As for me, I arrived carrying nothing but a calm expression and a secret neither of them could imagine. David arrived 10 minutes later. The moment Vanessa saw him, a flicker of confusion crossed her face. She recovered quickly, but I noticed it. She had not expected my husband's attorney to attend a simple family dinner. Throughout the meal, the conversation drifted from topic to topic. Work, travel, home improvement projects, real estate. That last subject appeared far more often than coincidence could explain. Several times Vanessa mentioned rising property values. Several times she spoke about the importance of planning for the future. Each comment seemed directed toward me without actually naming me. Finally, near the end of dessert, Vanessa lifted her glass and smiled. "Family is about preparing for the next generation," she said. Several people nodded. She continued, "Making smart decisions today protects everyone tomorrow." I almost admired the confidence. Almost. David quietly placed his napkin on the table. That reminds me, he said. There are a few family matters that should probably be clarified. The room immediately became still. Vanessa's smile faltered slightly. Brian looked confused. Emma lowered her eyes toward the table as though she already knew what was coming. David opened a thin folder he had brought with him. Over the past several months, he began, there has been considerable discussion regarding Margaret's future. Nobody interrupted. There have also been assumptions made about her financial circumstances. Vanessa shifted in her chair. The movement was small, but impossible to miss. David continued calmly. Most of those assumptions were based on visible assets that no longer exist. Silence settled across the room. Then he placed several documents onto the table. One by one. Partnership statements. Investment summaries. Property holdings. The numbers alone were enough to change the atmosphere. Faces around the table went pale. Brian stared at the pages as though they were written in another language. Vanessa stopped smiling entirely. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Brian looked up. Mom, what is all this? I met his eyes. The part of my life nobody bothered asking about. The room became even quieter. David explained the basic structure. The investments. The commercial properties. The decades of growth. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. Simple facts that completely destroyed every assumption made over the previous months. Vanessa looked stunned. Not because she suddenly respected me. Because she suddenly realized how wrong she had been. Yet the biggest surprise had not even arrived. David closed the folder and placed one final document on the table. There is one more matter, he said. Every eye in the room shifted toward him. Then he looked directly at Emma. And for the first time that evening, I saw genuine shock spread across Vanessa's face. David allowed the silence to linger. He had spent a lifetime around negotiations and legal disputes. He understood something most people never learn. The most powerful moment in a conversation is often the one where nobody speaks. Every person at that table stared at the final document in front of him. Vanessa looked anxious. Brian looked confused. Emma looked as though she wished she could disappear beneath the table. Finally, David opened the document and began reading. The language was formal, but the meaning could not have been clearer. Years earlier, my husband had established succession provisions for a significant portion of our long-term holdings. Those provisions included future oversight responsibilities, voting authority, and management participation. And the individual selected to receive those responsibilities was Emma Sullivan. For several seconds, nobody reacted. It was as though the words needed time to settle. Then Brian blinked. Emma, he asked. David nodded. Yes. Vanessa's expression hardened immediately. There must be some mistake. David calmly slid the signed documents across the table. There is no mistake. I watched Emma's face turn pale. She had known some of the story, but not all of it. She certainly had not expected this. David continued. Your grandfather believed leadership should be earned through judgment and character rather than assumed through position. That sentence landed harder than any number printed on the financial statements. Because everyone understood exactly what it meant. Vanessa stared at the paperwork. Then at Emma. Then at me. For the first time all evening, she seemed unable to find the right words. Brian looked equally stunned. Dad made this decision years ago, he asked quietly. Yes, David replied. Many years ago. Nobody spoke after that. The silence felt different now. Earlier it had been confusion. Now it was reflection. People were mentally revisiting months of assumptions and realizing how completely wrong those assumptions had been. Eventually Vanessa managed to speak. Why would he do that? Her voice sounded strained. David answered before I could. Because he paid attention. Another silence followed. I almost smiled. It was the perfect response. Over the previous months, Vanessa had focused on visible things. Garages, equipment, houses, appearances. My husband had focused on something else entirely. Character, integrity, patience. The qualities Emma demonstrated repeatedly while others chased shortcuts. The dinner ended not with an argument, but with an uncomfortable awareness that everything had changed. Guests left quietly. Conversations became shorter. Smiles became forced. By the time the last car pulled away, only 4 people remained in the dining room. Me, Emma, Brian, Vanessa. Emma walked around the table and hugged me tightly. I never wanted any of this, she whispered. I squeezed her hand. That is exactly why you were chosen. Brian sat silently for several moments before finally looking at me. There was regret in his eyes. Genuine regret. "Mom," he said softly, "I should have asked more questions." I nodded. "Yes, you should have." Vanessa said nothing. She simply stared at the documents one final time before gathering her things. As she walked toward the door, I glanced through the window toward the empty garage standing across the yard. Months earlier, that empty space had convinced people that I was running out of options. Tonight it revealed something very different. It revealed who people became when they thought they had nothing left to gain by respecting me. And in the end, that lesson turned out to be worth far more than anything that had ever been stored inside those walls.